We are going to follow the money.
Everything you need to know can be understood with this simple phrase: follow the money. And believe me, that's what's happened.
Here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money.
Welcome to College Sports Follow the Money, an all-new podcast diving into the critical issues surrounding the big business of college sports. I'm Andrew Monaco, joined by former president of Texas A&M University and former chancellor at the University of Missouri, Dr. Bowen Loftin, and former vice president and general manager of Fox Sports Southwest, Jon Heidtke. From NIL to the transfer portal and opt-outs, to the college football playoff, conference realignment, and more, we tackle the key issues facing college athletics today and into the future.
I need to feel you, Jerry! Show me the money! Jerry, you better yell! Show me the money! Show me the money! You love this black man!
We welcome you to another edition of College Sports Follow the Money with Dr. Bowen Loftin and Jon Heidtke. I'm Andrew Monaco. Episode number 51. I get this started by saying I knew there was going to be a change in college athletics, and I thought it might be seismic. Up until now, it's been tremors. But after this past week, this might be the seismic shift. There might be a super Division I, for lack of a better phrase. First and foremost, Dr. Loftin, how are you, my friend?
I'm okay, sir. Good to see you in the flesh anyway. I'm glad that John's back safe and sound from Las Vegas.
Yeah,
I worry about you, John, when you get loose.
We got to tether him back in. Professor Heidtke, how are you?
That's right. I'm still rolling the dice here. So doing very well. Great to get back. You know, Vegas is always an interesting city. I think it's truly now the city that never sleeps. I think it's going to take New York over from that. But a lot of interesting news coming out of the convention and the collegiate athletic forum they had out there.
Boy, what we know about college athletics may be transformed after this week. NCAA President Charlie Baker announcing basically a super Division I. No idea what we're going to name it. But if you're going to follow the money, right, guys? College sports follow the money. We've got to follow it right now because it's going to be going. To me, it's almost as if it's haves and have-nots now in college athletics. Am I too far off with that?
I don't think so, Andrew. I would say this, that reflects reality a bit. We all know that there are haves and have-nots in college sports. We all know that there are some conferences, we call them the Power Five now, maybe the Power 4.5 or whatever it might be, 4.2, that have the resources to be able to buy the very best. And I'm not talking about just buildings and equipment, but they also, I think, create a challenge for those without that. And my concern as a president who cared about students is that in so many schools, the kids pay the bills. Outside the Power Five, most universities and colleges have a sometimes steep athletic fee their students pay. And that literally funds the operations of athletics there. It's not a matter of football doing it all like we do at the Power Five schools. It's a matter of nobody can do it all. And therefore, the kids have to step up and pay the price. You probably saw recently where UTSA's student body voted against the kind of fee they were trying to lever there in terms of athletic fees for those students. And so this is the sort of place we're in right now. So I think this recognizes a reality. There are haves and there are have-nots. The haves in general are those schools we call the Power Five right now. We'll see how the pack evolves over the next couple of years as they shake things out. So at least we have four conferences that I think are healthy financially, and will get probably healthier over time. I just feel like we have to understand that our NCAA president was sort of reflecting reality when he said we have to create a subdivision within D1. And that subdivision is predicated really who can afford to put aside $30K per year for a kid, all the kids.
John, you were in Las Vegas.
Yeah. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise, when it came down there. I think, again, that was one of the overwhelming kind of sort of conversations that I had with everybody, both kind of, in the conference room and then, outside afterwards. I think, again, what Charlie Baker was trying to do as well, too, was saying, this is a conversational starter. And I think he really tried to focus on that. But in his memo, he tried to lay out some things that these are going to need to be addressed if we're going to, and he said it sort of all pointed to that sort of that new subdivision. And to Dr. Loftin's point earlier, I mean, there are even haves and have-nots in the, I call it the big two now. And then everybody else is out there. And even in the big two, there are probably some people that would think they're have-nots based on that process as well. So how do you define have and have-nots is going to be an interesting process going forward. And the other key takeaway was, I think, again, that a lot of people felt there should have been probably more, sort of it wasn't so much the number, what they were talking about. People said 30,000 times every student times X, it starts to, add up quite a bit. But then, for the schools that could do more than 30, what's to stop them from going to 40, 50, 60 and on higher? So I think there were some concerns about that process too, because it didn't seem like there was really a lot of thought put into, is there a ceiling on this versus more talking about this as a floor. So I think, again, everybody was kind of saying that, a lot of buzz, but I think, again, now the devil's in the detail on this process. And again, how does this shake out? And one of the interesting things that happened that last week too. So President Baker was speaking, and then the conference commissioners came on right after that. And I think they were a little bit sort of mystified, had not heard about this before having to kind of address it there in a public forum like that. So again, interesting dynamics in and out of the room there yesterday. But I do think a lot of the things that people said about Baker was that at least he's trying to get something done. And I think he said that over and over in his process. We've got to get something done in the NCAA. We can't just keep talking about it. We got to get something done. And that was one of the sort of overarching themes on this, other than these were all designed to be sort of, in his words, conversation starters.
Well, this is where I'll give him credit for doing that, because I thought the head was in the sand when it came to the transfer portal, not allowing kids to transfer, the tampering that's been going on in the transfer portal. When you put your name in and you already know where the destination is, that's telling me that you've been talked to. And NIL, the NCAA did nothing, and the states had to do it. And then the NCAA seemed to react to that. So I get the forward thinking here. I get it. The phrase that jumps out to me, though, that President Baker said was, we have to be urgent with patience. Now, I understand John Wooden said, be quick, but don't hurry. I get that. What is urgent, but with patience?
I think, again, I think the point he was trying to make is that particularly portal, NIL, some of these other things right now, if collectively, if we haven't come in as a governing body or at the conference level, how do we continue to try to move those issues forward so we can, I don't know if level the playing field is correct, but certainly creating some rules that everybody can sort of operate under and know those are within the parameters. I think from an urgency standpoint, that's certainly one of them. I do think, again, they were trying to get, they talked a little bit about, a lot of these folks have been on Capitol Hill, obviously, over the last several months, talked about, again, there seems to be some bipartisan support for an overarching, something coming from the federal government, but we don't know if and when that's going to come. And I think we've talked on this podcast before. I am always a little bit leery when you have to put your hands or your fate in government intervention. So those usually don't end well. So again, I just think there's a lot of issues there. And I think, again, the number one thing was just, okay, well, what do we do and how do we do it? And I think, again, if this gets that started, again, as you said, the inertia, we've had the head in the sand for quite a while over this process. The sky's falling. What are we going to do? Hopefully this starts the ball rolling to try to, again, put some action efforts into this process to see if we can get this, some of these questions answered.
Dr. Loftin, you laid out last episode about the potential suit and what that could do. Does this ameliorate any of that? Are they connected? Or are they two separate things?
What Baker said has no force in law. As he said himself, it's a conversation he wants to have. And he was throwing out a bone to the dog, rather, to get that conversation started. I got that. As Sankey said, and as also Baker implied too, this is not just the NCAA's issue and decision. The courts have been working on this for a while. You may recall when we started our podcast, John, July 1, 2021, That was immediately after NIL became the law of the land, basically. And that gave us a lot of fodder for our podcast here, and still does for that matter. But as you indicated too, Andrew, what happened here is NCAA abrogated its responsibility. It frittered away the opportunity to do two things. They could have gone and settled some of these lawsuits early on for a price, but yet not for the disruption of college sports we've observed. So their failure to act for a couple of years has allowed a lot of things to take place. And that's the problem with Baker's proposal. It is not a bad proposal in its face. I'm not necessarily rejecting anything he said here. But my problem is that in the meantime, lacking NCAA guidance and also legislation, they have simply had other things happen. For example, state legislatures have passed laws. A majority of our states have laws now. Well, those laws, in some cases, aren't consistent with what this man said. So how's that going to work out? Courts, there's a bunch of court cases in play right now. I mentioned one in our last episode that I think is very critical about really the literally paying of athletes and how that might pan out over time. But there's many cases pending right now, and judges tend to have the last say in any legal kind of conversation. You've got Congress itself. The one solution would be for Congress to turn their attention to something useful for a change and deal with the issue of college sports once and for all. I'm a little fearful of that, as Jon indicated. I have fear too. When the government's here to help, it's not always what you want to have happen. But at the same time, I think that's one opportunity that has to be allowed for. You have the opportunity for the conferences to come in. What surprised me, and Jon, I want your comment on this, Sankey indicated he was surprised by this. The letter that was sent out by Baker just before he mentioned this publicly went to the members of the NCAA, did not go to the commissioners of the conferences. And I thought that was interesting. An oversight? Deliberate? I don't know. But I mean, come on. If anybody has the ability to make something out of this, it'd be the commissioners of the relevant conferences. And they apparently were not even consulted about this beforehand, and they weren't even given a letter that Baker wrote before he mentioned it, and then they got copies of it through other channels. I find that just absolutely interesting that this happened this way. Did he not think about this? Did he deliberately snub the commissioners? What do you think, Jon?
I mean, again, there were some conspiracy theorists out there too this week. For me, it's hard to say. Again, not knowing how all those governance structures are set up, if they are individual schools, if that's who you have to send it to, then maybe that's what he was following the protocol on that. But it may have also been to kind of slightly send a message there as well. So it's probably somewhere in the middle of all those different types of things.
Interesting. Well, I just feel like that it was not a good approach to lay this out there without any kind of initial conversations with at least the commissioners and probably the members of the committee that actually govern the NCAA, which come from the schools there as members. So we have a bunch of presidents and chanters out there who I'm not sure they knew about it in advance either. I can't find any of them that say they did. And that may be true, may not be true, but I just can't find any example that he really consulted many people when he came out and said this. So it is a conversation starter. Sometimes you throw out something. I won't say the word here, but you throw something into the punch bowl to get the conversation started, and perhaps that's what he was just doing here. I just feel like that when you do it that way, you tend to create some antagonism at the outset that you could have avoided with a little conversation up front.
And you mentioned it, Dr. Loftin, this becomes things for presidents, chancellors, and athletic directors, correct? This isn't just ADs.
Yes, I mean, there's no way that, these are important decisions here. And the implication Baker has is that you as a school, the option of ponying up this $30K per player or whatever it might be at the end of the day, as an entry point for this new, as you called it, super D1 conference or D1 division issue here. I don't know if that really is going to be the right approach or not. It sounded like that, well, you make your own decisions as a school, whether you're one of these elite or not. by whether you can afford to put the 10 million or 20 million into the pot as an ante for being able to play the game. Isn't that what's happening here, John? We're talking about a game here that's going to be played by those people who can afford to ante up.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of talked about that the way the money's heading now. I mean, that's going to be part and parcel of it anyway. So I think again, it's the interesting thing too was they spent a lot of time talking about the positives of what NIL has done, and they used examples. Caitlin Clark was one. There were several others out there. There was one of the spot speakers was from a car wash that had done some things, conversations via car wash that were all NIL creative and the process. What no one really wanted to address was, again, I think this was Coach Rule a couple of other days ago as well. The going price for a quarterback is, 1 to 2 million in the portal. And so that's obviously not necessarily NIL. And does 30,000 per player become NIL too, or is that some other type of thing? So again, these are certainly questions that I think were, on everyone's minds about and how do you navigate those and what does that look like you going forward? One of the things, again, one of the other arching conversation I had with virtually everybody from every lens was that no one thought it was a good idea for student athletes to become employees. Even most student athletes felt that too. So what does this do? Is this part of sending a message to Congress so they can read about it and so their people get, a little, create more, maybe urgency there, from that standpoint? Does that help them to say now, okay, whatever guidelines we put in place, do we need to expand those to start to try to put those into sort of some parameters around those? And I think everybody was trying to talk too about one thing the NCAA is afraid of. They just can't keep making decisions and every time getting sued. And so I think there was a point about there regarding, okay, certainly there's some antitrust exemptions, but they're maybe very narrowly defined and they're not very broad based. And so I think that was something that was the conversations were out there too, because I think, again, there were several kind of, so sort of gallow jokes from the crowd about, some biscuits said, are we going to be sued today? So, they're still obviously very sensitive to that. And again, to your point, Doctor, I think they could have resolved a lot of these issues if the NCAA had been a little bit more, aggressive in trying to seek some solutions or some settlements going forward. But they weren't. Here we are. Now, how do we get out of this jam?
Yeah, you're right about that. Let's go one level below what we've talked about Charlie saying here. Charlie Baker also said other things. When he got down to a more detailed level, he mentioned that if you buy into this idea of having a super D1 subdivision, that subdivision would become very autonomous compared to what it is today. And he mentioned specifics. He said things like roster size. Think about that a moment. Let that sink in a moment. Roster size. Well, do I have 80 or do I have 150? I mean, there's a bit of a difference there, okay? Ohio State could probably put together a pretty good sized roster, folks. Then there's also the idea of how many scholarship students would you have? We had a history of walk-ons being interesting people, and we just celebrated here at Texas A&M recently the 12-man kickoff team. Y'all were there that night with Jackie Sherrill and talking about that, and that was a neat thing. Those were walk-ons, okay? They weren't scholarship players. So the details he mentioned were interesting possibilities. Talking about roster size, how many scholarships you have. Those are details that I think would have interesting implications if you were to allow a subset, maybe 50 schools, 60 schools, 70 schools, who can buy into this concept to come forward and set those kinds of rules on their own. But I come back to the idea that NIL is the law of the land right now. That's gone pretty far through the process judicially and has been sustained. And so I don't see that going away. I think regulation of it is still something that needs to be thought through carefully and probably is essential for it to be something over time that we can not only live with, but also flourish with. So I think that has to be worked through. And again, this comes then to the idea of courts, but initially of Congress and state legislatures making decisions about laws that can help put an envelope around this in a way that makes it more useful for the student athlete, for the school, and for us who are fans of the games.
Does it affect academics and scholarships in any way? And I understand the employees. It was told to me that each student athlete, 4 years of college, basically the investment by the university is $450,000 per. Now, do we start deducting the $30,000 a year from that? Do they stay on scholarship if they are employees? I mean, this becomes almost like a labor thing as opposed to a sports thing.
Well, it is. I think that's exactly what some people want to see happen here. The National Labor Relations Board has been slowly changing rapidly from what I said, radically from what it was. And I think you're going to see more and more of the regulatory world of employment paying attention to this and potentially dealing with this. You can imagine a union out there licking its chops and say, well, if I can now unionize 150 of these guys who are going to be making all this money, that's going to be money into their coffers to be able to do what they want to do and pay their executives high salaries and so on. So I can see some interesting things happening here that are driven by the natural inclination of a union to get their nose into the tent, a natural inclination of a agent base, if you want to call it that, a group of agents seeing this as one more place that they can add on to their income by having these additional pieces here coming into play that they get a percentage of. That's possible too. Humans do respond to financial incentives. There's no question about that, or financial possibilities. And I think there are going to be many here. So again, I just feel like that Baker had to do something, probably. I agree with that. But what he did may set things back a ways, because I suspect lots of people won't like it once they think about the possibilities here, and not having brought anybody on board to begin with. Who's going to champion this? Who's going to be the individual, the group who stands up and says, "Great idea, Mr. President of NCAA. Let's get cracking on it." I haven't seen that happen yet. John, have you?
No, but I think everybody's still kind of disseminating what all went down. I think from what he would always come back to us, these are conversation starters. These aren't hard and fast rules. So, I think one thing that we failed to mention too on this was he was talking about those 30,000 was going to be in a trust. So if you have to do certain things to achieve what that trust would look like, is that graduation? Is that obviously there'll be things along those lines. It wasn't pay for play, at that particular point in the conversation. So I think again that these are all things that are, I think again he wants to see something get done. I think was one of the overarching of his themes, and he realizes that the NCAA that's certainly not what they're known for. And I think again that trying to be taking on let's not forget. I mean, he was a governor of a state that was primarily Democrat as a Republican governor, so he was able to get things done. He was able to move things through. So I think that's been one of the points that I think we certainly get talked about. But I think again his ability to kind of work those political relationships both internally and externally are going to be something that's going to, I think, is what sort of I think makes him a unique skill set to try to champion some of these causes in the various halls that he's going to need to champion them.
So, John, you were in a place where you were mingling with people who were coaches, ADs, former players. Did you discern any sort of different group think about this? Were some groups like coaches or ADs thinking about this more differently than others were? So any division of the house yet you could begin to discern happening with this?
No, I think, again, it was interesting. And again, the conversations that I had with the various constituents we talked about, I think they were still trying to focus on, okay, we still haven't really addressed the elephant in the room, which is, again, the portal issue was something that people were concerned about too. What does that date start? Do we need to move that to January? I think there was, both coaches and ADs that I talked about, a lot of angst about the portal situation and, its opening and closing and what that means. And when we talked about the Ohio State quarterback, for instance, they're one game away from playing in the CFP, and he's gone. He's in the portal now. So what happens there? So there were those kinds of conversations that were happening about that process too, and how does the portal situation, can be pushed back, if you will, to let these guys set rosters. I think roster conversations were a lot with the coaches too about just, again, you don't know who's all in the portal. I mean, they could, you've got 30 days, right, to kind of put your name in and out. And so how do you even prepare for a bowl game right now, for crying out loud. So those were some of the things that the coaches had. I think the ADs were kind of still more focused on, okay, what does this mean? Were they taking it literally, what they were talking about? Okay, I've got 4 and some odd student athletes times 30,000 a year. What does that look like? Or is that one-time deal? If you got a student athlete there for 4 years. So there were, again, a lot of conversations, not a lot of answers, but I think most people were trying to, it was, okay, what does this mean to me? And I think that's kind of what the process was, and everybody was kind of looking at each other. So what do you think he's meant? What do you think he meant? And so I think, again, it goes back to the point that I think, again, the whole point here was this, in that environment, to kind of create this, again, as he liked to call it, conversation starters. And I think he certainly was successful there.
Well, you both have done this brilliantly behind the scenes. Everybody sees the handshake from both you guys when a deal gets done, but not everybody sees the sausage being made. Is this the sausage being made process where if there is a naysayer, they can talk to President Baker, or this is where the ADs get together and say what they say, presidents they say, have this all behind the scene where Baker now takes some of the flack for all of this, but it's a way of getting it done down the line?
I would guess that the most important conversation right now will be among the presidents and chancellors, because they ultimately are the ones that can vote on these committees of the NCAA, the board of directors, things like that. However, they won't do that in a vacuum. As a president and chancellor myself, I talk to my AD a lot. Depending on the nature of the issue, I might talk to coaches too, but I was trying to talk to the AD at length. And so I think that's part of the process going forward here, is that the NCAA is governed by its members through a board of directors and other committees that exist. And those members are largely people like I was, people who were presidents and chancellors of universities and colleges who were members of the NCAA. And I think that conversation is going to occur only in the context of those people seeking advice. Some ADs are very influential and some are not. A lot depends on the nature of the president or chancellor and their background. A guy like Harvey Perlman, for example, when I was in the Big 12, he was a chancellor at Nebraska. He was a track star back in college, and so he had a lot of background in sports as an athlete himself, and he brought that to the table. Not many coaches become presidents. I'll be the first to say that, but there are a lot of ADs who were coaches and certainly were players as well. And they'll bring their own sort of backgrounds to that conversation there. So I see a lot of talking going on now. I'm sure conversations have been started, which is obviously Charlie Baker's intent here, was to start conversations. And I think there'll be a lot of these happening very quickly. And we'll see how fast he can pull the horses together and the wagons surrounding them to give them some protection to be able to work through this in a meaningful kind of way. My experience is that legislation in the NCAA is even slower sometimes than that in Congress. It takes a while to get through. And this is what it would take to make his statements a reality.
If I'm a school that's not going to participate, do I still get a vote?
Good question.
You know what I mean? I mean, this John, to me, I always thought the breakaway was going to be Power 5. Dr. Loftin, I loved when you said Power 4.2. That's awesome. I thought the Power 5 was not going to share any longer with Group of 5, whether that was TV, money, bowl, all of that. That's what I thought. This adds another one of those shifts to that. And to your point, John, because you hinted at it, there are some schools within these Power 5 or Power 4 conferences that are going to have a hard time. Right now, they're having a hard time with donations for facilities or donations for NIL. Can they do both? Some can't. That's a dirty little secret in college athletics. Now you're putting even more pressure on schools like that.
Yeah, I had dinner with a couple of folks from a school that I won't name, but was in that group, but probably would be one of the have-nots in the Big Two. And one of their concerns was, how do we fund all this? And particularly some of these have other sports that they're bringing on board, and again, and they realize that football drives the bus, but what is the impact on what does this do to these other sports? What are we going to be doing to there as well? And I think one of the other underlying conversations that I had was, I think a lot of people are concerned that the general narrative right now on this is basically, here's all the things that are wrong with college athletics. There are some still good stories going on out there. And as an entity, college sports has not done a very good job talking about all the positives that are out there. And we always continue now to focus on the number one thing that comes up is NIL. So I think there was some concern there about, all right, how do we as an entity do a better job trying to tell these types of stories through that process? So I think that was some of the dialogue that I'd heard. But I think, again, it all boils down to, I think, again, if, whoever's going to be playing at this level, it's not going to be for the faint of heart, and they're going to have to make a serious commitment. And again, how many that's going to be? I think Baker talked at one point about it's 100. I thought that was a little, ambitious, with some of these things here. You're probably looking more maybe 60 max, and probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 when it all kind of shakes itself out at the end of the day. So do those guys all? Is it just for football, or is it all other sports? And to your point, Andrew, if there's TV revenues coming in, you're paying schools from some of these other areas. How do you keep them afloat? How do you give them money to subsidize them in that process? So, there are just a lot of moving parts out there, and we're talking about the NCAA championship events are coming up, and one of the conversations that came up was that in the NCAA right now, I don't know what the attendance number was, but they said over the last 10 years, there've probably been over 100,000 people that have watched or have gone to an NCAA championship tournament event, but they have no idea who they are. They have not been capturing that data. They have not been utilizing that data. That was a So how do you, I guess, take advantage of some of these things that are happening? Now, we're talking about NCAA. We've talked on this podcast, the value of women's basketball right now. I mean, there are analysts out there or consultants that have said that, hey, you're getting $38 million a year now. Your women's basketball should be 3 times that just for them. So now does that go to 120 and you roll all that in? What does that do to help these other schools to make that work? So again, there's just these issues here. And there was one question somebody flat out asked Baker. He said, well, does TV money go to the student athletes? And he said, no. Now, then he also came back and he said that, but however those schools want to do it, do they want to do it through donors? Do they want to do it through ticket sales? They will be having the revenue coming in. However, they decide what is the best way for them to build their budget or build their their revenue stream for that. That's up to them. Which would ultimately, think about it, include television revenue, because that's what every year the schools get a check from the conference for their media rights that they have. So. Again, it really got everybody talking. I mean, so that was, again, certainly one of the things there too. But it's where do these, again, if we wait for Congress, are we all going to be sitting around on our hands waiting for them to do something? And once they do it, everybody's going to have a hue and cry how terrible that was. Or how do we internally start to say, all right, how in our best interest, what do we do to help kind of, to move this forward? And historically, Andrew, as you mentioned, the NCAA 700 votes against the 40, 60 schools there, they always get outvoted in that process. So frustration, again, it's just what do they do? And I think, again, right now, you really don't have anyone. Baker's trying to do it from an NCAA standpoint, but he doesn't have a whole lot of bullets in his gun when it's all said and done. But how do these conference commissioners, how do these presidents of these big schools, what does it look like when they get in a room and say, okay, looks like it's going to be up to us to kind of figure this out, and what play box we want to play in, and what are the rules around those when we get to this level? Is that roster size? Is that trying to limit the amount of money you can spend for NIL, or if it's for your players, if it's not pay for play, whatever then other branding is? Because certainly some of this stuff isn't NIL, but there's going to be another nomenclature for what this kind of other fees are, how they make to do that. Is it an educational fund? Is it a trust fund? So again, fascinating stuff. And again, I mean, you could just see the wheels turning in everyone's heads as they were talking about this. And it just seemed like, instead of having, instead of solving a question or two, you had instead of getting answers, you had a lot more questions that came up.
That's true. A lot of questions now have come up, guys. And we can spend several podcasts probably walking through.
It's fantastic for us. Are you kidding?
It is. One thing I failed to enumerate a while ago that Baker was talking about was NIL. It came up in his remarks, and the comment was basically, well, look, this now frees up the schools to manage NIL themselves. Well, that's easy to say, but there are a number of state laws on the books right this minute that say you can't do that. Now, that means those got to be changed. That takes a few years sometimes to get done. I'm not saying it can't be done, but that's not going to be easily taken care of. And again, you have a lot of uncertainty about that, as Jon said. How do we do all this stuff? NIL is here to stay. I don't doubt that one moment. Just as an aside here, guys, I was having dinner with my wife a couple of nights ago with three young ladies who are student athletes. All three have NIL deals. Theirs are modest by comparison to some. They're aware of that, by the way. They discuss the numbers that they see some of their colleagues in football getting, for example. They aren't necessarily angry about that, but that led to the conversation, not from NIL going into, well, how about what's life after your sport like? Well, in some men's sports, there is a life after a sport. The NBA, the NFL, those are pretty lucrative places to go. Women's soccer was able to negotiate a real change of their compensation plan with a lot of pressure against the men, and driven by the success they've had both nationally and especially internationally in women's soccer. Does that spill over to volleyball, softball? That's the question. I don't know the answer to that. How much money is there out there, and how much money can flow into these sports that are that way? I mean, some of our student athletes who are female, their athletic career, no matter how good they are, may well end at a college level because there is really no place to go. I mean, sure, you can play pro softball, but I mean, the paycheck is not much there, not at all. Even WNBA players have to do what? They have to go overseas most of their year after their season's done for what? To make enough money to live on. So that's the reality of pro sports. But yet, NFL players, MLB players, players in the NBA, they can walk away with a fairly good paycheck, can't they? So there's a lot of inequities out there when you get beyond college. Is this effort to try to perhaps bring equity to colleges, at least some of the colleges who can afford it, is that equity going to spill over into the professional sports? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Jon can prognosticate about that, but I don't know the answer to that. And so I just see, like he said, there are a lot of moving parts here. I don't know who's going to turn the crank to get these parts all lined up and begin to turn out sausage for Andrew to eat. Okay.
Mind like a steel trap right there. He remembered that. Jon, it could prime the pump, though, for some sports, could it not? I mean, this could be the start, and we know it, but it may pay off somewhere down the line.
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, if you look at it straight and simple, if there are eyeballs, people want to watch, there will be people who want to advertise, there will be, money created on that. If you look at the football numbers, just again, this weekend, the Ohio State-Michigan game a couple of weeks ago, almost 20 million viewers. All right. That's the most watched regular season game probably in the last 20, 25 years before there were, you had limited choices out there. This weekend, the championship games, I think the Alabama Georgia game was the number one, but it was about 18 million, just a tad below what the Ohio State Michigan game did there. So again, you create great matchups that people want to watch. There will be revenue coming in for that. All right. I give Fox a lot of credit. I talked to Eric Shanks when we were out there, Andrew, and so obviously Fox was very excited about how their Big 12 or Big Noon games did out there, and they were the one window in sports this year, beating out CBS by a hair. And so they were very pleased on that. And what they did was on some NFL games this past year, they had put Big 12 or Big 10 volleyball after an NFL game, and it's done, 1.8 million, 1.9 million viewers. Now, is that people who were just watching the game, didn't turn their TV and stayed there? Or was it, is that sport having a chance to grow? I think it's probably a combination of both, but Fox was very pleased with that. So there was a lot of conversation, which we didn't get, about the renaissance of women's athletics right now and the viewership that they're starting to draw across the board with softball last spring. So again, I think there's windows there, but I think again, in this environment, in the domestic world that we live in terms of media rights, there's not a lot of those sports are going to probably, really translate well at the pro level to those kinds of numbers. But at the collegiate game, there are going to be opportunities to big. Again, we saw last year, the women's LSU Iowa game did almost 9 million viewers, and it was neck and neck with the men's game, Final Four, which is unheard of, from that standpoint. So they're there, but I think some of these things, are they sustainable? And I think they're going to see some things happen that are going to generate a little bit of revenue for them, but it's never going to generate what college football does and to a lesser degree what college basketball does. But still, there's some windows there. And so again, as you start to build this new model, whatever it looks like, how do you equate that into the process there too? So one of the other interesting conversations was, and we'll save this for another podcast too, but they had Jerry Cardinal there from who's sort of a private equity guy. And there's been some conversations about, okay, these private equity companies sort of looking about, and would they be able to bankroll some of these collegiate athletic, rights to then turn this into another, that super subdivision, super conference, whatever you want to call it, and help them drive some of the bus on there and take those media rights and turn them into, again, we've talked about, we've seen what streaming's done. We've seen what the college football, what the SEC is getting now. There's probably more there if these guys leverage it right and take the assets right and do it. So these private equity guys now are spending some time looking at these opportunities and where could they put some infusion into these collegiate programs that could then translate. I still, coming from our background, Andrew, that's sort of a pro team. You get some of that when you sell your team. No one's ever going to sell Texas A&M, for instance.
Right.
That's not going to happen.
Right.
So how do you manage that process? And there's probably value there, but how do you really unlock it? So that'll be some questions that people will start to try to noodle through here in the next months and weeks and months and years on this process. But that was one of Florida State's game plans to help them get out of the ACC.
Right.
So. And again, you want to talk about that is that one of the other conversations was, we talked about follow the money. If what happened in the college football playoff selection last week, Florida State, if there was, if they're now looking around, I'm staying in a Power 5 conference. I win all my games. I go 13-0 in my championship. I don't even get in. Is this the right conference for me to be in? So, I think, again, there are issues there that created some, concern for them on that process.
I can't help but think what Dr. Loftin talked about Arizona trying to sell off their athletic department. And now this falls in their lap, and how you were telling us how there are some schools, athletics on their own, academics play such a big part into all of that. Like, that's another interesting facet of all of this. I'm wondering, how's Arizona then go forward with this, with a move out of the Pac-12 to the Big 12, but possibly looking to shovel off their athletic department because of the debt?
Yeah, it's again, and that's why I think, again, you're going to see the real sort of, I think that the story that no one's talking about, even in the group of, let's just call it the Big Two, or the other 4.5, they're going to have schools that are going to be they're going to be more have-nots than haves, versus where they are in that process. So what does that line look like? What is all that? Where's the, again, this is all stuff that's got to be kind of determined and fleshed out. But again, it is it's a lot going on with very little leadership at the front right now to drive. I think Baker's again trying to do that, but again, he can only do so much as the NCAA.
Could it be just football?
Could be.
That's a good question, Andrew. I don't know the answer. It'll have to come out in the wash, obviously. But Baker was careful not to go there. He was careful not to say that.
Yeah,
football certainly has the possibility because it is the revenue generator, basically.
Yeah,
and it would, if you limit football, you limit the numbers. Although that's a big roster. So the biggest roster you got is going to be football.
See, 85 was the great equalizer. The 85 scholarships that allowed the Mid-American Conference, that allowed those 85 to play, and now you couldn't be. I'll use Nebraska as an example. You got all 150. You had red shirts, gray shirts, you had all types of shirts, and you took all those. 85 was the great equalizer. Now, if you count basketball, right? Last time I checked, there are some schools don't have football. They have just basketball. I don't know how that gets generated. Some of the Big East schools, the reason why they all moved off, a lot of the Big East went to the ACC. Some of the Big East basketball stayed. Well, that's a 15-person roster, but they're not getting the football money from all of that. Like, remember Gonzaga was going to come to the Big 12, right? They don't have football. It's just basketball. They're an attractive basketball property, but then dealing with all of this, again, a lot of questions.
Just to kind of turn us, as we begin to wind down here, to somewhat more controversial topic, that's possible. How about the CFP, guys? Florida State's not particularly happy right now. I think I have my own biases, as you might expect, about what's happening with the 4 teams that are going to be playing right now. I think that a 12-team playoff next year offers some potential ways to deal with some of these kinds of questions here. But I found one little news item yesterday I just have to bring forward here. Governor DeSantis, the Florida governor, formally yesterday was having a press conference talking about his budget request for legislature, which is like 114, $15 billion. Okay. He's saying, I've also included $1 million to augment the budget of Florida State University so they can sue the committee. Think about that, guys. Now, that may not get passed. It's something he can suggest. Legislatures usually are the ones that pass the budget laws and go forward with them, and the governor may sign them or perhaps line on veto some of the things. But again, he's asked for $1 million to help the Florida State folks file a lawsuit against the committee. I presume who else would you sue but the committee right now? That is the entity, as far as I can tell, that's legally responsible for the playoff membership decisions. What do you think, guys?
I think that's more political grandstanding, but I certainly think he's going to get a few votes from the FSU contingent for that. But I agree with you. I don't know how they would go about doing that. And then next year it goes to 12. So the irony was, I was talking to a guy from Oklahoma, and I said, well, if it was 12 teams, you'd be in the guys that were out. No, we wouldn't be out. They'd have done more homework and they'd have made sure. Because we beat Texas, I said we had to be in, so if that was it. But it was just interesting to say that, and even the committee, I think, said after it was to get through the first 6, they really, it probably wouldn't put a lot of effort into it. But it was just funny. Oh, no, we'll be in it. Because again, they would have been 13th this year where they were. And he said, no, we'll definitely be in. So just you can see next year, you'll have those issues and conversations about, okay, who's 12, 13, and 14 at the end of the day.
Having lived in the state of Florida and know how many Gators are in that state, but I know Florida State's right there in the capital in Tallahassee, so there's some sway there by Governor DeSantis, but they're going to have their own little infighting with just all the Gators and the Hurricanes and the Knights and the Bulls and all them in Florida. Here's the thing that I don't get in the CFP. How's Georgia fall to 6, losing to Alabama in an SEC championship game? That's my big thing. I don't know how you fall to 6. I don't know how you can win 45 straight. That's just me. But to me, in the CFP, haves and have-nots. If you haven't been there before, sorry, we don't take any new ones. An old coach told me there's 4 chairs and you got to wrestle one of those chairs. Florida State just found out they didn't wrestle hard enough. I guess they didn't have a sexy enough thing. My other thing is, it's all about offense. They only look at offense. Florida State's defense was great going 13-0. Defense doesn't matter to the CFP. That's just my feeling.
I thought defense won games, Andrew.
I thought it was too. I thought you were supposed to play each week and knock down each opponent, and 13 straight times Florida State did that. It was a mess. Yeah, it was a mess. I'm glad none of the 3 of us are on that committee, or that's where the questions would be coming in at collegesportsftm@gmail.com saying, Dr. Loftin, how did you leave so-and-so out?
Yeah, I ran into RC out there, and this was a conversation that we had with RC. I said, you as a former committee member and you are a coach, how do you sit there and how do you say that Florida State's not deserving? And so he was, I said, that would have been a hard one to get by, for me to being able to get outvoted on getting those guys in, because they did everything they could have done.
Yeah. And RC told me when he was on that committee, he had every team's possible team, the tape sent to him as a former coach. That was how he could best do it, going back to his old coaching ways. I guarantee you there weren't a lot in that committee doing that, but that's just that's an RC Slocum thing, right? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it the best way possible. He knows no other way. That's for sure.
The weekend. Is this the first time, John? The weekend of the various conference championships, the committee was meeting and was able to collectively watch all of these championship games, looking at the conference winners. Is that the first time it's really happened that way, where they did it as a group as opposed to doing it individually?
I thought they did it as a group this weekend. I thought they all sequestered themselves up in the Grapevine Hilton up there.
Yeah, they were together in one place, and I was told that they were able to collectively watch. I think it's one thing to watch a TV set or a DVD in your room by yourself, but something else when you're sitting with other people who have their own biases and so on. How does that really work? I'd love to be on fly on the wall there and see how that actually played out in terms of a collective viewing of this thing, if that's what really happened. That's what I was told happened anyway.
I didn't read this, but someone told me that there was an article by someone who talks to some people on the committee that they didn't name them. But one of this, if I heard this right, said, well, if Travis Hunter had been playing, that would have put that he would have voted, or I don't know, it would have voted Florida State in if Hunter had been playing. But since he was hurt, there was the story. Well, who do you least want to play? And with Florida State, if you were one of those other three teams, everybody would have probably picked Florida State just because they were offensively challenged there at the end of the year. So that was an interesting thing. Well, how do you not pick him then if they did everything they needed to do? And I guess now what you're going to see is all these injuries. He's day to day. He'll be back.
Yeah. Lower body.
Yeah.
Lower body injury. Yeah.
Lower body. Yeah. Exactly
Lower,
right.
Upper. Yeah.
Yeah.
All of
He's
that.
week to week. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating when it really should not have been conference championship weekend. You get all together. They should have been together the entire 13 weeks or 14 weeks. It's the entire body.
Sequestered like a jury. Put them in a room by themselves, you know.
They were 12 angry men and women.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm worried more about the 12 angry women. Right? Yep.
Now, and we can't go there.
I'm saying when you have the wife, she wants you home and you're not home. Ooh, you got to answer.
I understand that. I understand that. When Jon has a wife again, we'll see how that plays out. Then, Jon, I really
now I have to be honest. I know I've worn out my welcome when my wife says, "When's your next road trip?"
Well, she's calling for catering right now.
Yeah. My answer is usually it should be right now. So it might be a good time for me to leave. Fascinating, and I'm sure we're going to get back to a number of these topics that we touched on, but thanks for this time to both of you. Dalton, thank you as well. Again, collegesportsftm@gmail.com. For Dr. Loftin, for Jon Heidtke, for Dalton Hughes, I'm Andrew Monaco. We thank you so much for joining us on this edition of College Sports Follow the Money.